Hello and welcome to Ilemedia. We have previously looked at negative sides of the Olympics and today we will focus on the positives. At first, I'd like to debunk some of the foolish criticism Olympics have received and then see what the International Olympic Committee has done to make things better. Tokyo Olympics introduced as 5 new sports which will be on the Olympic program for the 2024 Olympics of Paris as well. These sports were 3-on-3 basketball, BMX freestyle, skateboarding, sport climbing and surfing. The introduction of these sports received criticism and some journalists called that the foolery sports should be removed from the Olympics. I, for one, enjoyed seeing new sports and new athletes. It's unlikely that one of these sports becomes my new favorite sport, but that's not really the point, is it? I think new sports are brought to Olympics so more sports and athletes can receive the attention they deserve. It takes tremendous amount of skill to be amongst the best in the world at any sport. The most important outcome of introducing new sports at the biggest stage is that more people start to practice these sports. At the end of the day, the most important thing is that we and the future generations practice sports. Whether it's football, climbing or boxing is secondary. And to be fair, people liking different sports than you shouldn't really be a problem. You don't have to like every single thing on the world, but it's just stupid to hate or dismiss something you don't like. Not everything is made for you or for me. It has been criticized that the Olympics are nationalistic if not a chauvinistic event. The term nationalism has many definitions which often have negative echo on them. For example, the Oxford Languages define nationalism as identification with one's own nation and support for its interest, especially with the expense of other nations. And that's just rude. Chauvinism, meanwhile, means exaggerated or aggressive patriotism. I think it's extremely important to realize the context when we start to throw around terms such as nationalism when we talk about sporting events like Olympics. My definition for nationalism in sporting context is much softer and I associate nationalism with national pride. For example, when an athlete is competing at Olympics, I think they are proud of where they are from and cherish the opportunity to represent their country at the biggest stage possible. Maybe athletes can even draw strength from the positive traits associated with their home countries, such as being hard worker, competing with honor, delivering results despite being the underdog, and so on. I believe that athletes compete to win the event and test their skills against the best competitors possible, not to prove that other countries are worse than their own. So when I hear people describing the actual sporting event as nationalistic, I think they have failed to understand the very essence of sport and have taken things out of context. Maybe they just see countries such as United States, Russia and China lining up on the starting line instead of the athletes of those countries. Of course, there are rivalries in international sport and some of them are driven by geographics as countries compete against their neighbors. I believe that even in these cases, the main focus is to win the competitor or the match in question instead of proving that one country is superior to the other. For sure, there are fans and maybe even athletes who take things to the extreme, but I believe they represent a small minority and their actions, while disgraceful, shouldn't put the whole competition to shame. And then let's focus on the positive sides of things. At the Tokyo Olympics there were athletes from 206 different nations, making the Summer Olympics easily the most international competition in the world. Or should I say intergalactic, since there are only 195 countries on Earth. In reality, some dependent territories such as British Virgin Islands and Cayman Islands were allowed to compete under their own flags despite being part of the United Kingdom. Anyway, back to the point. It's fantastic to see so many nations being represented at one stage, which for me just highlights the sport's ability to connect people. I think it's great that we can celebrate and showcase our own cultures, but also acknowledge the fact that we share many things such as love for sport in common. At least for me, big part of the Olympics is to learn something from the host country's culture and learn stories of the athletes I didn't know before. On the last video, I criticized the expensive host city bidding process. The IOC has recently updated the process and the new revolutionary approach to electing host cities aims to significantly reduce the costs for potential hosts. Under the new guidelines, Olympic Games should adapt and fit to the host city's projects rather than host city trying to adapt to the needs of the Olympics. The IOC aims to work more closely with the host city and greater emphasis is paid on the legacy and sustainability of the Games. The goal is to use as much existing and temporary facilities as possible, even if those would be located outside of the host city's region or even in another country. The results are promising, and it is estimated that in the 2024 Olympics in Paris, 95% of the facilities are either existing or temporary. And the 2028 Olympics of Los Angeles would be competed solely on existing or temporary venues. By a contrast, only around 60% of the facilities used at the Olympics between 2018 and 2022 were either existing or temporary. The potential host of the 2026 Olympics also spent 80% less on the bidding process than the cities who bid for the 2018 and 2022 Olympics. Under the new rules, the potential hosts are required to provide information of the vision, legacy, and many other aspects of the Games on the Future Host questionnaire. As a part of the IOC's plan to increase transparency, these documents, along with many other documents, are made available online. The potential host cities are requested to provide guarantees that back their promises, but I think in reality it would be difficult for the IOC to monitor, yet alone punish the host cities if they just lie. For example, Rio de Janeiro promised to take good care of their facilities after the 2016 Olympics, but as we learned on the last video, that really didn't happen, and many projects were abandoned the second the Olympics ended or weren't even started on the first place. The IOC aims to increase discussion and cooperation between themselves, national, meaning countries' own Olympic committees, and the potential hosts. Any party who is interested about hosting the Games can enter into non-committal dialogue with the IOC's future host commissions. This dialogue doesn't need to be edition-specific like it was in the past. For example, if an interested party doesn't get to host the Games they initially wanted, they can still discuss about hosting different Olympics in the future or perhaps hosting a Youth Olympics instead. This wasn't, at least in theory, possible in the past, as potential hosts were required to bid for a specific Olympics, and if their bid failed, the process would be started again for the next Olympics they'd like to host. Under the new guidelines, the IOC can also target potential host cities if it's beneficial for the Olympic movement. Apparently, this wasn't possible before, but I find it hard to believe that the IOC didn't previously contact potential hosts in huge sports markets and tell them they'd like them to host the Olympics. I guess the only way to avoid these sorts of things from happening in the future would be to write the legacy requirements down as conditions on the host city contract. However, based on the wording on the IOC's website, it doesn't sound like they will especially enforce the rules. Since I mentioned the future host commissions, let's briefly look at what they do and what's their role in this. The IOC created 2 future host commissions to ease the host selection process, one for summer and one for winter Olympics. The commissions are gender balanced and represent full range of Olympic stakeholders, including athletes, international sport federations, and national Olympic committees. The commissions consist of the IOC members who are not on the executive board, so the responsibility is shared between the larger group of people, which is obviously a good thing. The main task of these commissions is to explore who is interested about hosting the future Olympics. Later on the process, they evaluate the potential host cities' documents and report their findings to the executive board of the IOC. As mentioned on the last video, the 4-year cycle presents some issues around the Olympics' popularity. Sport fans love to follow their teams from season to season, and in many sporting leagues there is something to pay attention to even when the actual sport is on a break. That's not really the case with the Olympics. And to be clear, people absolutely do follow Olympic sports as they continue to have their own competitions outside of the Olympics, but competitions like World Athletics Championships aren't associated with the Olympics. The interest cycle towards Olympics shows quite nicely when we look at the Google Trends of the World Olympics. For argument's sake, let's compare how National Football League, or NFL for short, is googled during the same time. On the Olympics case, we can clearly see 2 large peaks, which are Summer and Winter Olympics, and the pattern keeps repeating itself. On the NFL's case, we can clearly see the pattern of different seasons, but between them is the NFL draft, which generates some interest too. But every 4 years, Olympics is the biggest talking point and dominates the headlines. It is true that the television viewership numbers of the Olympics went down in countries such as United States in this year, but then again, television has lost its viewers to streaming services across the board. Time zone plays a factor too, and countries close to Japan, such as Australia, reported that viewership numbers of the Olympics have increased. Despite the reduced number of viewers watching the games on television, the Tokyo Olympics is still expected to break all sort of broadcasting revenue records, showing that the Olympics are still hugely popular. The Summer Olympics of Tokyo had over 300 events in 33 sports, and the Beijing Winter Olympics of 2022 will have 109 events in 7 sports. In most sports, the Olympic gold medal is the most sought-after possession. There are more prestigious awards, especially in men's team sport, but I'd argue that in almost all individual sports, winning the Olympic gold medal is the highest possible honor. It's not just about winning the medals either, as competing at the Olympic stage is a career-defining moment for many athletes. Athletes have a vision about the Olympic dream, that one day their names could be associated with some of the greatest Olympic athletes of all time, like Michael Phelps and Usain Bolt. Michael Phelps himself has described Olympics as a life-changing event. Many athletes comment on competing at Olympics as a dream come true and are proud that they have inspired the next generations of athletes. It's easy to understand the meaning of Olympics for athletes just by looking at all the Olympics team tattoos. And that's it for the video. There are certainly more positive things about the Olympics, but I wanted this video to be sort of a response video to my previous video of what's wrong with the Olympics. I could have talked more about the great history of the Olympics and so on, but maybe some other time. Until the next one, take care and thanks for watching.